Welcome back to another Blender tutorial, and today's lesson is going to be on lighting and just general practices while rendering a scene. I think rendering is one of the most important parts. Oftentimes you spend hours if not days on a model and it's looking fantastic, but you're eager to see it rendered, so you rush the lighting, you rush the camera settings, and then all of your hard work just ends up looking terrible. Luckily, it's really easy to fix lighting, and I'll show you some good steps and practices to use. For this lesson, I'm just going to be using this box, but you could use the default render cube or Blender cube, any kind of object to light your scene. I'm going to try to be taking this scene from this, just the default render, and I'm going to turn it into this. I have changed nothing, no quality settings, anything like that. I've just changed the lighting. And as you can see, it changes a huge aspect of how the final outcome will be. So let's get into it. But before we start with this, let's go and see what kind of lights Blender actually has. Blender has 4 lights, even though for the majority of the time, you're just going to use the point light. But let's see which 4 they actually use. So just hitting Shift A, any kind of key mappings I do, they're going to be here on the bottom right in case you get lost. So we got the lights, and as you can see, they've got point, sun, spot, and area. Each of them have their own specific use case, but like I said, we normally just use the point light. So if I hit into rendered mode, just gonna turn this one off quickly. Now we can see what each light does. So let's start with the point light. Like the name suggests, a point light is just a point or even a dot of light. The power, or which is measured in watts, will change how bright it is. So if we make it 10 watts, it'll be a little bit brighter. The radius is going to determine how sharp our shadows are and where the light affects. Next light is the area light, which is almost like a square block of light shining down. Very simple, other than the shape, it's exactly the same as the point light. Next, we have a spotlight or cone light. These are often what you see in movies when helicopters are chasing, or in model showrooms. It is a cone of light that is kept to the area. And then the last one, which is a sun. As you can see, when I turn this on, it's going to just shine everywhere, even despite being behind a wall. So as the name suggests, the sunlight is a sun for your world. This is typically what games would use, or if you're rendering extremely big scenes. Other than those cases, you normally would not use the sunlight. So let's turn that off. And yeah, those are just literally a quick introduction to what the 4 lights in Blender do. For this tutorial, we're mainly just going to be using the point light, but we might use a spotlight as well. So let's move over to our subject. There we go. So hit 0, you can go into your camera view, and then let's see the rendered mode. Right now we have no lights, so let's first do that. I'm going to Shift A, add a point light, and then just drag it up. After adding a light, let's see how it looks. Not too bad, but it's probably a bit dark. So let's maybe put it up to 100 watts for the time being. And that's good enough to work with. Next, what you're going to want is something for the light to bounce off, because right now our box is just floating in space. So the easiest way to do that is just going to add a plane. Once you add your plane, you can either move your model up or your plane down. I'm just going to move the plane down because it's way easier. Line it up with the box, and there you go. But now when you go into camera view, you can see, the plane's not covering anywhere, or not everything. So a lot of you want to just scale it up, kind of get it there. And for the time being, that actually does work. But let's say you wanted a bit of a lower angle, or you're working with a bigger scene. You could just infinitely scale this up, but a better practice is to scale it down, select the edge where the camera is facing, hit E to extrude it. Let's make sure we extrude it straight. Then select into edge mode, so let's lock or select this bottom edge, Control B to bevel it, and then I'm just going to scroll my wheel across a bunch of times, and then hit shade to smooth. Now this makes it look, let's maybe scale that up just a bit. There we go. This is kind of what gives us that empty void, or kind of that infinite view. So you never really see the edge of the plane, but the plane doesn't take up that much bigger. You often see this in actual like modeling studios or camera studios. They'll normally use a sheet that just goes all the way from the top to the bottom of the floor. So now that we have our backdrop, let's go back into the camera view and let's look at the render. Extremely bright, but already just adding the backdrop, we now have some shadows in, some bouncing lights, and it's looking a lot better. So let's click on our lights. I think my lights are just hidden somewhere. I'm just going to quickly try and move them all to the right spot. Okay, there we go. I've moved them out. They were by mistake stuck in some of my collections. All of these collections are just based on the model and backups. All the props that we're going to be using for this tutorial, I'll make sure to leave outside of the scene collection. So now that we've added our backdrop, let's go back to the normal mode. We're going to be switching between rendered and modeling view mode quite a lot. So a better practice would be to just grab the top left corner, drag your screen across, then on the screen, hit the 0 key to go into your camera view, and then scroll wheel to slide across this menu if it's not big enough, or you can just make it big enough to select there. Then scroll across and select the rendered view. This way we can leave half of our screen just to view rendered view, and then we can work in the modeling view to adjust the lights. This way we'll get real time to see what our render is going to look like, but we'll also have ease of access and we'll be able to freely move around our scene. For those of you who have 2 monitors, this would be a great time to just pop one of the sides onto a different monitor. So let's grab our light. It's just kind of hiding behind our camera there. And now as you can see, we can easily move this to try and get the right lighting. Right now this light's a little bit bright for me. So I'm going to go down to the light settings and I'm going to maybe make this 50 watts. That's looking a lot better. The shadows are quite sharp. So let's change the radius. This is now going to make the shadows a bit more fuzzy, a little bit softer. If your viewport is a little bit blurry or taking really long to load, if you go into your render settings, make sure cycles is selected. If you have a GPU, you definitely want GPU compute on. And then just maybe change your samples. If it's rendering super quick, you could probably put your samples up a bit. If it's its time to render, maybe lower your samples. I like 32, which I think is the default, and it's fine for my use case. Let's go back to the light settings. I'm quite liking these settings. The shadow's right and the brightness is quite good. But I think I'm going to add a secondary light, perhaps of a different color. These often help to like accentuate or like highlight those hidden details in your model. So I'm just going to hit Shift A. I'm going to grab another point light. And I'm going to move it off to the side. Maybe a little bit to the front. There we go. And now this is super bright. So I'm going to maybe make it 2 watts. And since the gem and the watts of the cloth is red, I think I'm going to make the light red. Let's do that. Oh, whoops, I say make 12 watts instead of 2 watts. And then I'm just going to adjust the radius, just to make that light a little bit softer. You can really spend an infinite amount of time on this process, just finely tuning it. You're going to want to render it, go back, change things. But to keep this tutorial, under like 15 minutes, I'm going to do somewhat of a rush job. There, I'm quite liking that. Another way to also move your lights around is go to top view and then select your lights. This way you can really get the kind of angle you want on your shadows. But I quite liked how it was, so I think the lighting's all good. What you might also want to do is change your camera. To move your camera, you can just move it like an object by selecting it and hitting G. But a better way is go into the first person view, hit N on your keyboard, make sure you're in the view tab, and then click camera to view. Now, when you scroll, your camera will move with you. This way you can get those exact kind of angles you want. So let's zoom in, make sure the whole thing is in frame. Yeah, that's looking good. So then once again, just hit N and then make sure to untick camera to view. That way now you can move freely without disrupting the camera. So once you're happy with all the lighting, let's hit F12 to give it a render. Once your render's done, there's still actually settings you can adjust. So let me just try and move our render to one view and blend it to the other. It's going to be a bit messy because I'm trying to show it. Normally you would just want to tab out or have one of these over the other. So if you go to your render settings, you scroll all the way down into this little tab that says color management. If you go to that, you're going to get a thing called the look, or I don't know. Yeah, I guess it's just called look. I guess it would be called color management look. And it's normally default set to medium contrast or sometimes none. I like to put it onto medium high contrast or sometimes high contrast. And all this does is it makes the image a little bit more vivid and it gives it a bit more contrast. The other things you can also change is exposure and gamma. So like they would do in a camera or in even Photoshop, they make it brighter or darker, highlighting the shadows, or taking the shadows back a bit. Now you could do this in an app like Photoshop, but the reason you want to do it in Blender is because this has access to the raw file. So these filters that you're applying are going to take away no quality at all from your final render. Whereas if you were to use Photoshop, you're going to be adding more data to that picture, it's going to get a bit more compressed, and it just won't look as good as adjusting the composure or exposure inside Blender. So I like that exposure level, and medium high contrast looks good. You can always go higher, but as soon as you start going a little bit higher, it gets a bit too dark and a bit too saturated, and it starts to look a little bit fake. I found medium high contrast to be quite good. So let's actually go back to our render view. Another good tip is that you have multiple render slots. So when you like something, you can leave it in the slot you've just used. Go back to your thing. Let's maybe change the angle a bit by hitting N, locking camera to view, and then rendering it again. Now while this one renders in slot 1, we still have our old one in slot 4, and we can still save it. This way you can have almost 8 slots. I think you can actually make more slots, but you can have 8 slots or 8 pictures at once to kind of test around with. This way you don't pull your files up with attempted renders or renders in process. You can try 8 different ones and then only save the ones that you like. And yeah, that's really about it for lighting. It's quite simple. Oftentimes you're going to want to change the backdrop, but now these things are more going to be preferences. I normally use this general approach. Sometimes you have to use a little bit different kind of approaches depending on the models. For example, this isn't really going to work with the cityscape or natural environment, but with, single based objects, it normally works. So yeah, hopefully you found that helpful. And if there's anything you would like to ask, just drop a comment down below. I recommend definitely taking tons of time with this process because once again, you want to show off all that hard work you've just done on the model, and oftentimes just the final render, just the camera work will make or break depending on how well your object does or how many views it gets. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.